Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone, and welcome to the next session of the conference, which is going to be on risk management. My name is Delia Grace. I'm a professor of food safety systems in the University of Greenwich and a scientist at the International Livestock Research Institute. I'm very happy to be your moderator for this, what promises to be a very interesting session, and we have some excellent speakers who I will be pleased to introduce, and then we will continue with some audience participation. So first, let me introduce Hilda Cruz. She is a Norwegian veterinarian with a PhD in microbiology, and her career has spanned research, risk assessment, and scientific advice. Starting with, she has also been Director of Health Surveillance at the Norwegian Veterinary Institute, from where she joined the World Health Organization, then moving to SAO, and now working at the Codex Secretariat, where she's overlooking the standards development and particularly decision-making process of the Codex. And I'm sure she'll be able to give us some insight into how that important organization works. Our next panelist is Mr. Masahiro Sai, who is a senior researcher at the Yokohama Plant Protection Station at the Ministry of Agriculture, Forestries and Fisheries in Japan. He has worked on pest risk analysis and for the last decade, and is particularly interested in phytosanitary regulations and implementing PRA training in Southeast Asian countries. Our third speaker is Joanne Wilson, Principal Advisor in the Animal and Plant Health Directorate in New Zealand. She has been there for nearly 30 years in roles spanning research, emergency response, trade negotiations, and regulation. Currently, she provides advice on SPS and risk management decisions, and is the Southwest Pacific Region representative on the IPPC Standards Committee. Our last but not least panelist is Dr. Francisco de Alessio, Deputy Head of the OIE Standards Department since January 29. Born in Argentina, he holds a veterinary degree and a postgraduate specialization. Before taking this position, he worked for the Argentinian Agri-Food Health and Quality Service as a head of epidemiology, and he has also worked at the Infectious Diseases Department in the University of Buenos Aires, and has had broad experience with the World Animal Health Organization, or OIE, as we often refer to it. With that brief introduction, you're going to get to know the panelists much better during the next session. Let us move to a poll question for the audience. Hopefully you've seen how to do these Zoom polls, and you'll be able to respond within about 45 seconds. So our question for you is, who is the most important risk manager? And you have 4 choices. We talk about risk management, but of course, to manage risk, there must be a manager. So please just respond. Don't need a quick, detailed think about it, just your immediate response. Maybe Camille, can you let us know, do we have enough responses to show the audience poll? Please go ahead and share screen if we have it. All right, so we see a vote for the government agencies, it seems. And that's, well, we have some government agencies on our panel, so we'll hear what they say. So with that, my first question is to Joanne. And here in this session, we're going to be looking at existing guidance, how we do risk management better. By the way, I think all of those are risk managers in their own way, but of course, some are more important and some may be less important. So to Joanne, what international standards are currently available for guiding contracting parties on pest risk management?
Well, thanks, Delia. Well, there's quite a range of phytosanitary standards available, and they Some of them are quite general, some of them are more specific. We start with ISPM 1, our phytosanitary principles for the protection of plants and the application of phytosanitary measures in international trade. Of course, that is an overarching standard. It talks about our SPS principles and how phytosanitary measures should be based on a policy of managed risks, recognising that there's always going to be risk involved with importing plants and plant products. Then we have ISPM 2, which is our framework for pest risk analysis. This provides quite an overview of pest risk analysis process, and of course, pest risk management is stage 3 of that process. That's provides quite a brief background on risk management. Same with ISPM 11, which is another pest risk analysis for quarantine pests standard. So again, they're quite general. There are more specific standards available. There's an ISPM 14, which talks about the use of integrated measures in a systems approach for pest risk management. There are also other standards which are really targeted towards risk management. So things like our phytosanitary treatments for managing a specific phytosanitary pest risk on a particular commodity. So there's the IPPC is actually building up quite a collection of those, and that's very useful for our contracting parties. But apart from the standards, there's also an e-learning module on pest risk analysis available, which has a section on pest risk management. So there's training kits, pest risk analysis, fact sheets, and stuff about specific treatments. So there's quite a range of resources out there already. Thank you.
So thank you for that information, and I hope the audience also now know better where to go for help. I also like to point there's no such thing as zero risk, as we say, and as the general public doesn't always understand. So with that, let us move to Francisco to tell us a little bit how the World Animal Health Organization standards address risk management.
Thank you, Delia, and good afternoon. So yeah, the approach that is taken by the UI standards, so naturally the member countries are the one taking the decision on how to manage the risk. So this is in line with what most participants said, and our standards related to trade are presented in 2 codes, the aquatic code and the terrestrial code, and in those codes we do have several chapters. We have what we call horizontal chapters that are dealing with horizontal topics that are probably more relevant to risk assessment, what we discussed earlier this morning, or general principles on how to identify the hazards, which are the diseases that should be considered, the general measures to control or to define the animal health status of a country or a zone. And then we have the disease-specific chapters, which are where the most, let's say, specific management measures are presented per disease, and also following a structure approach that takes into consideration the animal health status of the country and the specific commodities. So for most of the listed diseases, so we will have an individual chapter where we will have specific recommendations, definitions. We will have specific recommendations on how to define the health status for a country, zone, or compartment for that disease. And then you have the specific measures that should be considered for trade. And there's normally we try to have more than one option, so to give also different alternatives or equivalent alternatives for members to select. And then eventually also for some diseases there are specific recommendations for the inactivation of the pathogenic agents. So this is the standard framework, and the idea is that you should not only look, or countries should not only look at the individual disease-specific chapter or the specific article where let's say, the measures for the certificate are presented, but also to the full system approach that will help them also identify the status of origin or how to define all those measures for the full process. Over.
Thank you, Francisco. Very interesting. And from plants, we move to animals, and we finish up on the plate, which is where animals and plants often finish up themselves. And with that, let me ask Hilda what Codex guidance there is for risk management.
Many thanks, Delia. And first of all, it's a pleasure being together with you all. And many thanks to WTO and the SPS committee for organizing this timely and exciting workshop. And I'm encouraged to see the enormous interest in the topics we are addressing in the workshop. When it comes to Codex and risk management, we need to recall that Codex Alimentaris is a collection of internationally adopted food standards and related texts. And one can say that what Codex is doing as a standard setting body for food safety and quality is risk management per se. And Codex is developing standards, guidelines, and codes of practice through a consensus building process involving the members and observers based upon science and risk assessment. And the development of Codex 6, which is in the end is a decision-making process, can be considered risk management. Codex texts include around 225 standards, including 11 general standards and 214 commodity standards, 79 guidelines, 54 codes of practice, 113 maximum levels for contaminants, covering 18 contaminants, more than 4,500 maximum levels for food additives, covering 376 food additives or groups of food additives, more than 5,600 maximum residual limits, MRLs, for pesticide residues, covering 231 pesticides, and finally 632 maximum residual limits for residues of veterinary drugs in foods, covering 79 veterinary drugs. Then there are Codex texts that more specifically address risk management, such as principles and guidelines for the conduct of microbiological risk management, guidelines for risk analysis of foodborne antimicrobial resistance, risk management recommendation for residues of specific veterinary drugs, and working principles for risk analysis for food safety for application by governments. The guidelines and codes of practice generally provide more concrete guidance to national governments in regard to risk management related to specific issue or specific foods. Examples include general principles of hygiene, a flagship Codex text, principles and guidelines for national food control systems, and code of practice to minimize and contain antimicrobial resistance, the latter which is currently being revised. It should also be emphasized that Codex texts are voluntary in nature and need to be translated into national legislation or regulations in order to be enforceable. But as you know, Codex standards are considered scientifically justified and are accepted as the benchmark for WTO in regard to international food trade against which national measures and regulations are evaluated. Thank you very much. Over.
Thank you. Thank you all for that overview of risk management. And now I will ask Masahiro a question about the risk analysis process, which especially pest risk management, where you have much expertise, is sometimes seen to take a long time and maybe even reduce access to markets. How do you think international standards can be used to guide an efficient and fair trade?
Okay, thank you, Delia. So, in order not to be considered a barrier, trade barrier, and in order to facilitate trade, transparent and harmonized process is required for conducting pest risk assessment and pest risk management. Therefore, I believe the existence of international standards is important. The IPPC provides harmonized PRA process as standards. In addition, the IPPC provides specific standards related to pest risk management. So I'd like to explain two examples under IPPC. One example is international standards for phytosanitary treatments. As pest risk management options, there are irrigation, fumigation, and temperature treatment for targeted quarantine pests on commodities. These treatments are conducted according to treatment schedules consisting of parameters such as temperature, duration of the treatment, or concentration and the dosage of the treatment applied. The effective parameters are different by pest and commodities. So the treatment schedule is usually determined based on the combination of a target pest and its target host plants. This point may become a bottleneck to take a long time for pest risk management. As international standards, if the IPPC can provide effective treatment schedule for pests and their host plants, member countries have concerns, they may be able to reduce time to complete pest risk management and implement the treatment with transparency. The IPPC has been working for developing international standards for phytosanitary treatment as annex to ISPM number 28, phytosanitary treatment for regulated pests. The IPPC has now 39 treatments under ISPM 28, and we are also working for developing further treatments. Another example is developing commodity standards. The IPPC is currently focusing on developing commodity-specific standards as higher priority. The IPPC has already developed or has been developing standards for commodities in a broad sense, for example, seeds, woods, wood packing materials, cut flowers, and grains. In the near future, we will also develop standards for commodity in a narrow sense, for example, fresh mango fruits or capsule seeds, something like that. The commodity standard will provide a list of pests associated with the commodity and the examples of pest risk management options for these pests. Therefore, it is considered that member countries can shorten the analysis process, ensure transparency, and harmonize the phytosanitary measures by providing commodity standards as useful guidelines when considering pest risk assessment and pest risk management. So I introduced two examples of IPPC. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It always helps to give examples. I think it makes things clearer to everyone. So now we go back, audience, to you and another poll for your participation. And this is asking about what worries you most in terms of food safety: chemicals, microbes, or genetically modified organisms. This is again a very personal question, so just put down what you worry about. Again, we'll just give about 20 seconds for everyone to cast their vote. Voting is free. And we'll remind you that we hope to keep the last 15 minutes for a question and audience session with the audience, with you. And so can you please put any questions into the chat box so that we can make sure that your voice comes on the floor. Maybe at this point we can just see what the results of the poll are. Microbes. I think we have a very well calibrated audience, but let's hear more about that. So now I'm going back to Hilda and the Codex, and to ask a somewhat related question, that when we conduct surveys in high income countries, low and middle income countries, we often find that consumers and decision makers are actually more concerned about chemical hazards and GMOs, while scientific risk assessments, and indeed the latest global assessment of the burden of foodborne disease by the World Health Organization, tend to suggest that microbes and parasites actually have a bigger burden. Have you experienced any of these differences in your career? And how does this translate into risk management when what people worry about and what makes them sick and kills them is not necessarily the same?
Thanks a lot, Delia. Thanks a lot, Delia. This is really interesting. And first of all, I would believe that the COVID-19 pandemic has changed quite a bit this picture, with an increase in concern regarding microbiological hazards. In Codex, we do not really see the pattern that you referred to. In surveys that we have conducted regarding what members see as so-called critical and emerging food safety issues, the topics that typically are identified, and it varies a little bit from region to region, but nevertheless, typical issues that are brought up include contaminants, pesticide residues, pathogens, new technologies, antimicrobial resistance, food fraud, and climate change. Thus, the picture is rather mixed. The FAO and WHO risk assessment bodies that provide the scientific advice to Codex, that is JECFA for contaminants, food additives, and veterinary drug residues, GEMRA for microbiological hazards, and JMPR for pesticide residues, and GEMNU for nutrition. They will respond according to requests from the Codex membership and discussions in the relevant committees. Thus, the issues that governments are particularly concerned about and would like to see be addressed by Codex should first be brought up in the relevant Codex committee, and thereafter a request for risk assessment might be posed to the concerned risk assessment body. And the result of the risk assessment will then be brought back to Codex for further development of a relevant Codex text or ML or MRL, which again is risk management. Thus, the scientists that we are working with, they respond to the requests that usually originate from the member countries. Thank you very much. Over.
Thank you. That's very helpful. It seems too that the member countries are better calibrated than the general public at large, which is encouraging to see. So next to Francisco and the World Animal Health Organization, I'm a researcher, and I've been researching food safety, animal disease for the past 25 years. And I would say that the surveys we carry out in especially low and middle income countries, we typically find that from 30 to 100% of food doesn't meet national standards. And much of this food is sold in informal markets, you know, the traditional wet markets where poor people tend to buy and sell more. So what support, given this context, what support do you think international standard setting bodies like OIE can provide to help implement standards?
Yeah, thank you, Delia. So first, it's an important point, and I think you mentioned there national standards or international standards. It sounds like a little word, but it makes a lot of difference because, as we said before, the members are those really implementing and taking the risk management measures at a national level, but also when it comes for international trade. So from the OIE perspective, it's really trying to build capacity in member countries also again from a system perspective. We do have a long-standing process to build capacities of veterinary services in general, so what we call the OIE PBS pathway, because most of those common factors applies to all animal diseases or to all animal surveillance, and then at the end we'll build a strong system that will support the management measures and eventually trade if it's the priority. And then we also have dedicated strategies to work on priority topics that have been identified by the World Assembly, like specific disease, like for example African swine fever or foot and mouth disease or Pest de petit ruminant, or other topics which are not diseases like antimicrobial resistance, that do have their own capacity building activities to always based on the existing international standards and try to promote the implementation and the capacity for that. When we talk about trade, there are specific OIE programs that are quite relevant to facilitate disease management that has to do with the management of disease or animal health information, all that has to do with the national surveillance systems and the notification systems and the information that the OIE makes available to the international communities with the World Animal Health Information System. and also has to do with the animal health status and promoting the national programs to control diseases and to achieve, let's say, a better disease status that will end up in having safer products, that both for the internal consumption, but also for trade if need be. And under those specific lines, there are specific capacity building activities to try to bring the standards close to countries, and also countries more aware and more capable of implementing them. Over. Thank you.
Thank you. And I might add that the OIE is also a key player in a relatively new initiative called the Global Burden of Animal Disease, which aims for the first time to evaluate what is the burden of animal disease, as has been done for foodborne disease and for human diseases. And this would be an extremely powerful tool for risk managers, because for the first time they would be able to see what is the priority animal diseases in their context. I think we have just about 2 minutes for Joanne before we move on to the next session, which is focusing on gaps and areas for further work. So Joanne, regarding risk management options, do you think the industry standards are being utilized in part of these international standards Francisco was talking about, and how is that working out? Thanks.
Thanks, Delia. So although we don't, the IPPC doesn't use industry standards directly, they do involve the industry in expert working groups. They might also involve them in the standards, not directly in the standard setting process, but they will accept case studies from an industry perspective when they're developing the new standard. And of course, industry also are able to provide feedback on draft standards via their national plant protection organisations. So some examples of where the IPPC have included industry representation are in the Sea Container Task Force, also the grain standard that was drafted. So for the Sea Container Task Force, they included members from the International Maritime Organisation, World Customs Organisation, as well as some other industry observers. So their input into those committees are really important. For the International Movement of Grain, they had 3 invited industry experts in the expert working group, and they were able to provide some really helpful background and views about industry practices. Coming up soon, there's going to be an expert working group for an annex to ISPM 38, which is about the design and use of systems approaches for phytosanitary certification of seeds. And that will include at least one expert nominated by the industry. And it's their knowledge and operational industry seed quality systems information that they can provide will be really helpful for that particular group. But the consideration of industry standards does not necessarily need to occur initially at the international standards setting body level. There's nothing to prevent contracting parties from evaluating industry standards for compliance with importing country requirements, for instance, or even as requests for equivalence. So in future, if industry standards are accepted by more than contracting parties, there may be an opportunity for them to be included in some of the specific commodity standards that are coming up for development, which my colleague Masahiro talked about earlier. So thanks, Delia.
Thank you. And that brings to a close our first session. Our first section of this session, and now we move on to gaps, opportunities, and areas for further work. So let me ask Hilda first, what new issues do you see emerging in relation to risk management?
Thank you very much, Delia. This is really exciting. And well, in Codex 3 years ago, we conducted a survey among members regarding what they identify as critical emerging issues. The emerging issues that we frequently mention were food fraud, climate change, e-commerce, and novel foods and new technologies. With FAO and WHO, we are currently discussing the issue of new food sources and production systems, including alternative protein sources. Some of the more prominent topics that have been identified are edible insects, seaweed, microalgae, cell culture-based food products of meat, fish, dairy, plant-based protein alternatives, and 3D printed foods. We expect to see more discussion around these topics in the near future, including at the upcoming 44th session of the Codex Alimentarius Commission that will be held in November this year. Another overarching theme that we also will need to address more in the work of Codex is sustainability. There are 12 goals to be achieved by 2030 through the UN Sustainable Development Goals, and Codex is part of this. Thank you.
Thank you. That was very informative. Do you see these novel foods as having more risk or less risk than conventional foods, or is it too early for us to tell?
That requires a good risk assessment, so there is no simple answer to that. We need to address it from many perspectives, so be it regarding hygienic issues, pathogens, but also contaminants. There are also labeling issues, nutritional issues, and also more the broader environmental issues also looming there. Thank you very much.
Yes, we can see it's a very complex area that's going to keep people busy over the next few years. So moving back to Joanne, can you tell us about any exciting or innovative approaches to risk management, especially as regarding plants, or also pertaining to risk management strategies? Thank you.
Oh, thanks, Delia. So actually, Hilda just made a comment about e-commerce, and I think that's really interesting area for the IPPC at the moment. And it's an area that we're focusing on in the development agenda. It's recognised that, of course, trading directly with consumers will continue to expand, and this expansion of trade increases phytosanitary risk. So the Implementation and Capacity Development Committee of the IPPC is aiming to coordinate international efforts to address the spread of pests and pest host materials sold through e-commerce and distributed through the postal, mail and courier pathways. So some of the initiatives, well, I think they're quite innovative because of the large scale that this is on, is aimed at the coordination and across, a large scale coordination effort basically. So some of the initiatives, first and foremost, the implementation of an international communications effort. This is a massive feat, I think. The effort will target e-commerce trading companies and consumers so that they understand that importing countries may have phytosanitary requirements and why those requirements exist and how to comply with those. Another initiative is the establishment of an interagency network to create synergies in developing a joint policy and recommendations for courier and postal pathways. The joint agencies will include agencies such as the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species, or CITES, World Customs Organization, and the IPPC and other interested agencies. So to complement this, an e-commerce guide for plants, plant products and other regulated articles will be developed. The e-commerce guide will focus on electronic transactions that lead to the international movement of plants, plant products and other regulated articles, particularly those that follow non-traditional distribution pathways. So things like business to consumer and consumer to consumer transactions. It'll also offer guidance to assist MPPOs to strengthen their cooperation and communication with other relevant border agencies to improve this collaboration at a national level, just so that we can facilitate low-risk trade while ensuring that our phytosanitary requirements are met. So lastly, the development of implementation of policies, programs or mechanisms for sharing information on best practices and encouraging traders to follow the requirements. So it's a really developing area, and there's a lot of resource going into this, and hopefully will be successful, the whole coordination effort. Thank you.
Thank you. And of course, we understand that the COVID pandemic has led to a big increase in e-commerce as people have been more confined to home. So with that, maybe I'll continue on the COVID theme with Francisco, taking us back to a predominant hypothesis that wet markets, wild meat-based food systems were involved in the emergence of COVID-19, as they have been demonstrated to be involved in the emergence of previous zoonotic outbreaks and epidemics. What do you think can be done to safeguard food systems against the risks of emerging disease? And maybe just remind us a little bit about why zoonoses are important as well for our friends who may focus more on plants than on animals. Thank you.
Yes, thanks, Delia. Well, actually, I think it's what happened last year with the COVID pandemic and the risk feared or associated at some point with animal products. It was a good example of how international organizations can help or can contribute with members to manage this. The key point is it's about transparency, for example. So the OIE does have a mechanism by which members notify emerging diseases, and this information is analyzed and shared with members. So that it's a key point with these new threats or these new issues. In the context of COVID, quickly joint mechanisms involving animal health experts, wildlife experts, human health experts were put in place to process the information as it was coming along, and risk analysis-based guidance was quickly published to be available to members to help them make decisions or risk management decisions, like, for example, how to manage the risk associated with working with wildlife or working with livestock, or even with the fur industry that at some point was where the risks were more really identified for trade or businesses. In the long run, the OIE is fully convinced that there's strong association and strong collaboration from the multiple sectors in the countries is essential to have strong national systems that are able to detect and share information quickly to manage the risk from the very beginning, or to discuss together what needs to be done. On that sense, we have launched a new line of work, a new strategy based on all this discussion from last year, that it's what we call the OIE Wildlife Health Framework. It is really a holistic work to try to identify how to better manage risks from emerging diseases at the human-animal ecosystems interface, while still protecting wildlife, that it's a key resource for many countries as a natural resource, but also as a source of income and food for many livelihoods. I don't know if I covered your point about zoonosis, but I went a little bit over other places.
Yes, no, I think people are much more familiar, even with zoonosis or NOTS, herd immunity, things which people never talked about before. Everybody got a crash course in epidemiology last year, unfortunately. With that, let me move back to Joanne. And the question is, are there any plans for providing additional guidance or standards on pest risk management in order to harmonize risk management options?
Yes, there certainly is. And the IPPC have recognised that there is a need for further guidance on it. So 2018, an expert working group was set up to draft a new standard called Guidance on Pest Risk Management. So as I talked about in the first question, a lot of the guidance that we have is quite general. So this guidance on pest risk management will actually help that. It's also expected that there'll be more specific guidance on pest risk management as more commodity-based standards are actually proposed as new topics. So Masahiro has already talked about commodity-based standards for phytosanitary measures. So I think that will be a really useful area for development. But, you know, if any participants in this meeting actually have ideas for guidance or standards that would be useful, then I encourage them to actually submit them in the IPPC call for topics. So the IPPC runs a call for topics every 2 years, and this year the call has already opened. I think it ends about September. You know, that's a really useful time to do it. I think Masahiro talked about potentially a new standard for a commodity standard for mangoes. So pest risk management will be included in that. So if there's any more gaps, please do put your hand up and suggest things. Thanks.
Thank you. And a follow-up question then for Masahiro. What additional guidance will the new ISPM guidance on pest risk management provide to contracting parties?
Thank you, Delia. So as my colleague Joanne explained, IPPC Standard Committee are working for drafting guidance on pest risk management. This draft standard addressed the aspect of the pest risk management, such as when phytosanitary measures is necessary, to what extent phytosanitary measures should be applied, how key concepts such as managed risk, technical justification, appropriate level of protection, and equivalence related to it, and how countries can improve harmonization. In connection with drafting the standard for pest risk management, we are currently working for revising the existing PRA standards. So I'd like to introduce about this work briefly. Under the PRA process, the conclusion from pest risk assessment are used to decide whether pest risk management is required and the strength of measure to be used. In this way, pest risk assessment and pest risk management need to be closely related. The IPPC has two PRA standards, ISPM 2, Framework for Pest Risk Analysis, and ISPM 11, Pest Risk Analysis for Quarantine Pests. Especially, ISPM 11 also covers pest risk management stage, which may be duplicated in some part of the draft standard for pest risk management. Therefore, IPPC Standard Committee discussed about how to deal with this draft standard and related parts and sections of the existing PRA standards. The IPPC Standard Committee concluded that existing two PRA standards and draft pest risk management standard, these three standards need to be integrated into one standard to avoid redundancy and ensure consistency. And contracting parties also approved this work, so we have already drafted the specification for reorganized PRA standards. This draft specification has been consulting at the member countries' comment period from July 1st to August 31 this year. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. It seems there's a lot of exciting new initiatives going on. I'm sure members will be pleased to hear about those. And with that, we come to the third part of this risk management panel. And this focuses on international standards, regional standards, and national authorities. But first, let's take it back to the audience for another poll. This one is asking you, do you participate in international standard setting activities? This should be an easy one. You probably know whether you do or you don't, or whether it's not applicable. But we'll still give you 30 seconds so everybody gets a chance to vote. So maybe we can start sharing the poll. Okay, that is again, may explain why our audience is so well informed, because a majority are actually participating in international standard setting activities. So then back to our panel, and this time the first question will be to Hilda, and it's about how international standard setting bodies have dedicated efforts to enhance participation, especially from countries which sometimes have more barriers to participation. And what do you think more or is being done to help participation in the Codex? Over to you, Hilda.
Thank you very much for this, Delia. In the Codex system, we have the FAO WHO Codex Trust Fund, which is providing support to eligible countries to support their effective participation in Codex. The first Codex Trust Fund that ran between 2004 and 2015 supported over 2,300 participants from developing and transition economy countries to participate in the international standard development process, and provided FAO WHO Codex training to over 1,200 people to boost the effectiveness of the participation in Codex. Building on the success of the first Codex Trust Fund, the Codex Trust Fund 2 started in 2016. And in CTF2, which will run for 12 years, the focus was shifted from widening participation in Codex to building strong, solid, and sustainable national capacity to engage in Codex work. And countries are being supported through focused 3-year projects. Since April 2020, all Codex activities have had to be implemented virtually. The Codex Secretariat has worked extensively to increase outreach to the membership during the pandemic to ensure continued engagement and work continuity in the absence of physical meetings. The provision of virtual means to engage in Codex work has led to increased registration in meetings by both members and observers in Codex committees. We have seen significant increase in number of registered member countries in several Codex sessions this year, and also larger delegations. This is positive in terms of increasing involvement in and understanding of Codex work among the broader Codex membership. However, more time and analysis will be needed to understand how effective such participation is and how it impacts the development of Codex standards. Thank you very much.
Thank you. That's very interesting. So it's one of the kind of slightly positive impacts of this terrible period we've been living in, that we are actually developing new ways of working. Numerous conferences on food safety have been put onto online platforms and work reasonably well, although we still miss the face-to-face interaction. So now the same question to Francisco, please. What more can be done to help participation of countries in OIE standard setting and processes?
Traditionally, the main tool that the OIE has had to promote the engagement of member countries in the standard setting activities was the different sets of trainings. We had a network of national focal points on dedicated topics, and one of their key roles is to follow a certain topic and to promote the engagement within the country to participate in the OIE standard setting process. Since a couple of years now, but lately from last year, we are undergoing a full review of the OIE training system, and it's going to be there is a new OIE platform for the training of veterinary services that include many aspects, but also trying to promote the participation in the standard setting process. Also, a point that may seem minor, but also this year we had to face the need to organize our General Assembly virtually, and that was really an opportunity for all of us to try to thinking new ways to promote engagement of members in a quite traditional key activity, because it's where we adopt most of our standards. And we really explore new ideas on being more communicative and being closer with members that most or some of them would be probably retained and explore as new functions. And then I think there are two very exciting lines of work towards the future. One is the creation of the OIE Observatory on the implementation of standards that is finishing its first exploratory phase and probably moving into an implementation phase. It's a process that we've been going with many partner organizations. It's going to really provide insight on how members are implementing the standards. And also the other one that you mentioned, Delia, is the GBAT programs. That is really going to be a new way of of dealing with the information that we have and how we can use that information to better understand the issues, the magnitude, the impact. And I think that is also going to give members another vision, another visibility of the impact of the standards or the interest of being involved in the standard setting process. Over.
Thank you, very helpful. And so to our third sector, the plants, maybe Joanne can give an answer from your perspective at the IPPC.
Thanks. Well, yeah, the regional bodies of the IPPC have a really important role in encouraging country participation in their activities. So the main mechanism for IPPC regional bodies is to support countries to contribute through their annual regional workshops. And those workshops are used to identify comments on draft standards. So they're coming up shortly. Regional bodies can also support countries by identifying and running workshops that might target a specific area of interest within the region. And there's also a role for participating countries to support others within their regions. So as the other two speakers, Hilda and Francisco, have talked about, in these COVID times, the regions have had to be a lot more creative with their initiatives to get countries involved and contributing. And I've got a great example of this from the Pacific Plant Protection Organisation. So the PPPO, this regional organisation initiated informal virtual monthly meetings known as Talanoa sessions. Now, the word talanoa means to talk and speak, and the sessions fit with the Pacifica culture really well. Now, these sessions have provided an opportunity for all countries to hear about what's happening at the international level and how they can get involved. And it's really ignited quite an energy within the Pacific that I'm really proud of, as being a member of the Pacific as well. So in each of these sessions, each country in the region have the opportunity to showcase their country-specific contributions and ask really pertinent questions, and it's been a great development tool. So the advantage of being virtual has meant that more people can observe and contribute compared with if meetings were held in country. So post-COVID, this type of intersessional initiative could really support participation in international standard setting work, and I really hope that we can continue it. Thanks.
Thank you, Joanne. You talk quite a lot about how important the regional organisations are for helping international standard setting. So maybe we can move over to Masahiro to ask about regional standards. As regional standards in themselves, and what do you think is the role of them in risk management?
Okay, so thank you, Delia. So I'd like to describe the regional standard in the IPPC. So in the framework of the IPPC, there are 10 regional bodies, Regional Plant Protection Organizations, RPPOs. So the function of RPPOs are mostly laid down in the Article 9 of the Convention. One of functions is cooperation among regions for promoting harmonized phytosanitary measures. Yeah. And each RPPO has its own activities and program. One of their activities is developing one regional standard for phytosanitary measures. Several RPPOs have regional standards for common issues in the regions to achieve cooperation among regions for promoting harmonized phytosanitary measures. For example, in Asia-Pacific region, we have Asia and Pacific Plant Protection Commission, APPPC, we call APPPC. The APPPC has developed 11 regional standards for phytosanitary measures for common issues in this region. For example, natural rubber is one of important products in Asian region. South American leaf blight of rubber is a fungal disease of rubber trees as a regional common concern to rubber industry. Therefore, the APPPC developed as regional standards the guidelines for protection against South American leaf blight of rubber. This standard provides information about PRA and pest risk management options for this fungus. And another example, mango production is also common industry in the region. So APPC provides regional standard for phytosanitary measure for fresh mango fruits. This regional commodity standard provides information about pest and pest management options for mango fruits. Like APPC examples, regional standards can address the region self-topic under the cooperation of member countries in the same region. That's all from me. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I think it's an important point that when commodities are specific to a region, you don't have any rubber plants in Ireland, where I come from, then there is a strong role for having regional approaches to addressing them. So with that, I think we're closing the formal panel part of this session, and we're moving on to the questions and answers from the audience. Or rather the questions, I think the answers will come from the panel, but please jump in if you have anything to say. We will look at all the questions. I can see some very interesting ones coming up, but we may not have a chance to cover them all. So don't hesitate to, get back in touch if you'd like further information. Maybe I'll start with something quite specific for Francisco. It's about the trade in live fish for human consumption. What is the situation? Is the guarantee, I'll just read it, is the guarantee required that no pathogenic bacteria virus is present? And what can be done in the case an importing country requires this assurance, given that we've already heard someone say there's no such thing as zero risk? What's your opinion on that, Francisco?
Yeah, thank you, Delia. I think I can answer part of the question, and probably will invite Hilda to take over on that one too. So on that aspect, I don't see it clearly in the question, but from, let's say, an animal health perspective, there are specific requirements according to the disease, and it's not about it's not about zero pathogen. We will have specific recommendations for each disease, and we have this in the case of fish and aquatic animals. We do have also clearly defined susceptible species that disease should apply, and the relevant measures for each of those diseases and each species. When it comes to the consumption of fish product for human consumption, I think I would probably invite Codex to respond to that, because I do think that they have specific standards for fish and fish products.
Thank you. With that, I'll pass on to Hilda to talk about the consumption end of the movement of live fish.
Thank you very much. Yes, indeed, we have there is a specific committee on fish and fishery products, and they have over the years developed a lot of different standards and codes of practice and guidelines related to fish and fishery products. And for instance, there is an overall code of practice for fish and fishery products that is overarching. So that committee is specifically addressing fish and fishery products, but of course also standards from and guidelines and codes and practice from our general subject committees might also be relevant to fish and fishery products when it comes to hygiene and contaminants and additives, for instance, and labeling issues. I hope that's helpful. But yeah, again, please have a look at the code of practice for fish and fishery products. Thank you.
Thank you. I think that's pointed the questioner in the right direction. So from the specific to the very broad, we have another interesting question, which is asked from the risk assessment perspective, but I guess also you can answer for the risk management perspective. How can we balance economic considerations versus agricultural considerations when the service sector trade is strong? Maybe we ask Joanne first.
very difficult question to answer, I think. We've always struggled with economic, how you balance the economic, how you actually work out what the economic impact of something is going to be if it actually enters your country. Yeah, I'm sorry, that's a difficult question. Yeah, I don't think I have a perfect answer for that one, just because of the difficulties in predicting what could happen and how we determine what an economic impact would be. Maybe my colleague Masahiro may have more of a better answer for that one, perhaps.
And maybe I'll just follow up. Do you see any issues when trying to include sustainability more into some of our international standards? Is there a clear way forward on that, or is it going to be another complicated one to solve?
Yeah, I think it is a complicated one to solve, and that probably needs to be done on a by contracting parties and how they think about sustainability. I don't know that that's something that we can necessarily put into a standard. Maybe we can, in a standard, we can say that, you know, consideration can be given for sustainability. We do talk about feasibility and practicality currently in the IPPC standards, and that we should have that as a consideration. I'm not sure how we would provide guidance on that, but, you know, maybe that's up to our implementation and capacity development committee could think about ways to help people with and guide them through that, or guide countries through that.
Thank you. As you said, a complicated issue. It's always difficult balancing different societal objectives, be it gender, nutrition, food safety. So maybe I'll just ask if anyone on the panel, Mr. Masahiro or any of our colleagues would like to add. Feel free to just agree that it's complicated. I think, Francisco, please jump in.
Yeah, Delia, thanks. I think I really thought about the question from the risk management perspective and how to take into consideration the economics and the interaction with the private sector to take those decisions. And I think that is, from my perspective, one of the how to say, more important contribution of having a standardized system where we can have standards on for the different aspects of risk analysis, that members who are interested in develop supply chains for export can predict or can have some certainty how the process would go, because developing those supply chains take time and a lot of investment, and we cannot wait, or countries cannot wait to develop the supply chain before they got the agreement. So at some point, or for animal products, it may take, I don't know, 5-10 years to build an animal health status or to grow animals in a way to sport. So having the standardized system with standards that are recognized internationally, and members using those for the risk assessment and the risk analysis and for the risk management of import and export, it really gives an important thing. And countries should work in private-public partnerships, putting together governments who are defining the national regulations and the interest of the producing sectors to really develop these supply chains together in a way that they take into consideration the international standards, so they are safe for trade in a way that then they will be accepted by the international community, and this would be sustainable over time. So I think it's a very interesting aspect of the impact that our work as standard setting bodies have in the economy of import-export businesses. Over.
Thank you. We have another very topical question from the audience, which I think I will direct to Hilda, because she has a lot of experience working with national and international health-related organizations. And that is, are there any lessons to be learned on risk management from the COVID-19 response, which some think was not as good or not as prompt as it could have been? Over to you, Hilda.
Thank you very much. In regard to COVID, it's not a foodborne disease. nevertheless, we did contribute with reviewing food safety guidance in regard to COVID pandemic, and we encourage to actually implement the international best practices that were already there and developed on food hygiene in general, as well as in handling meats and other foods and to control viruses in food. So we encourage using what was there. In the future, we might perhaps have a pandemic that is more related to food safety as such. So we need to be also prepared for such a situation, and also for that reason, we need to be prepared to look into emerging issues, what might come next, and discuss that, and be prepared for developing necessary guidance. And we also, should the need be, we could also have a fast track development of standards, like we did, for instance, for the melamine crisis several years ago, that very quickly there could be a standard developed. In COVID, we didn't need that from a food safety perspective, but we need to be prepared in the future that there might be also pandemics or epidemics that are specifically related to foods. Thank you. Over.
Thank you. I may follow up with Francisco on the same question. As we mentioned earlier, a lot of these sort of outbreaks of zoonotic diseases have been associated with wild meat, or as we call it in Africa, bushmeat. Is this something which the World Animal Health Organization looks at or has plans to look at?
Yes, Gilda, I think, sorry, Delia. As I mentioned before, there's a specific line of work starting now and for the coming years, that it's what we call the OIE Wildlife Health Framework, that it's to look a little bit closer to this interaction. So the OIE has been working in wildlife for a while and also looking into this interaction, but this increased focus in this area is naturally, bringing us to develop a specific line of work to work closely in this. But at the end of the day, I think it's similar to what Gilda said. It's also part of the looking or having a special look to something that we were doing before with other kinds of animal products and other kind of standards. Over.
Thank you. I think it's going to be a lot on the agenda of a lot of international organizations increasingly.
And if I may just add that also in the Codex Committee on Food Hygiene, they are also now developing guidance for the management of biological foodborne outbreaks, which is also important, interesting work. So there will soon be guidance coming out in that regard specifically. And also we are developing, or we have also texts related to food import and export inspection and certification that also should be adhered to. That's also important in regard to outbreaks and epidemics. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And over to Masahiro for some rather specific questions about IPPC, suggesting is it or could it be within the scope to look at microbial standards and antimicrobial resistance standards?
Okay, just a moment. Sorry.
Sorry, it's about the scope. Maybe Joanne can also jump in. The scope of the IPPC. Could it cover, or to what extent it covers microbial hazards and antimicrobial resistance?
I'm not really sure if it can or not, but it's perhaps something that could be proposed as a topic through the current call for topics, and it will be the task force on topics that would decide whether that's relevant. I don't think microbial ones would be, but that would depend on what our task force for topics would decide, actually.
Okay, I think, as you say, these issues emerge and some of them they weren't there before and they become important, and others we feel might be outside the scope of certain organizations. I have a question now on food safety, I think, and we're going back to the specific. It's about the international view on the management of noroviruses in, for example, oysters. And are there guidelines on these? Hilda, do you have anything from the Codex on norovirus in oysters?
Thank you. Yes, actually we do, and we have guidelines on the application of general principles of food hygiene to the control of viruses in food. So that's a more general hygienic guideline regarding viruses, and then we also have. I wanted to put it in the chat, but we also have standards for live and raw bivalve mollusks. That is from the Fish and Fishery Products Committee. So these two together address issues of viruses and in oysters. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I mean, oysters are best eaten raw, in my opinion. So they're very important to have good standards and ways of controlling pathogens in oysters. Well, with that, there are some other very interesting questions in the Q&A, but I think we're running short of time, so we'll have to leave those for another occasion. I would just like to thank the panelists very much for giving up their time and preparing such good and detailed responses. So round of applause. And with that, I would like to hand over to Gregory MacDonald, who will take the floor for some concluding remarks and give the floor to the next roundtable. Thank you all, and thank you, the audience.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very
much, Julia, for facilitating that roundtable and echo your thanks to all the speakers in this roundtable for the discussion and sharing their perspectives on Codex, IPCC, and OIE risk. We'll now move to our...
There is an echo on the line.
Day.
Having some echo from the speaker. I think maybe he needs to switch off his speakers.
I therefore invite the moderator and speakers in this roundtable, Professor Steve Hathaway, Mr. Kunyang Ling, Mr. Johnny Marchand-Pena, and Mr. Toyu Espodonia Zanata. Sorry for the mispronunciation. I'll ask you to turn your cameras on. This last roundtable of the day will be moderated by Professor Steve Hathaway. Steve Hathaway is trained as a veterinarian and has worked in a range of regulatory positions in the field of operational research, risk analysis, and standard setting. He is now the Chief Food Safety Scientist at New Zealand Food Safety within the Ministry of Primary Industries. Professor Hathaway, I'll turn the floor over to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Greg, and for launching this roundtable session. And greetings to all, wherever you may be on our Zoom-connected planet. While I am calling in at 2:15 a.m. on a cold and wintry night in New Zealand, I'm very pleased to be able to participate in this workshop, and many thanks to Cami and her team for all the work they have done to put in and make the success it already obviously is. I would like to kick off the session by talking a little bit about our objectives. I want to introduce the most important ingredient of the session, our three panelists who will share their insights with us, and also cue in two short videos that will, amongst other things, begin to make us think about the importance of actors other than government in risk management. So, to our topic. Risk management in regard to the SPS agreement and setting international standards. has already been extensively discussed in the previous session, with our topic, sharing of successes, challenges, considerations, impacts, and best practices. Now is the opportunity for members to discuss their practical experiences in terms of implementing risk management and decision making. Under this umbrella of operationalizing risk management, we will ask our panelists to consider three themes. Firstly, to explore practical aspects of risk management in terms of identification and selection of risk management options, implementation of measures, and monitoring and review. We will also ask them about the challenges that they have experienced in risk management at the domestic level, and in respect of the agility of risk management decision making, how have contemporary changes in the international trading environment impacted on assurances of the level of health protection that is required by governments? And as an example of this, in an era of COVID and remote auditing, we are certainly having to meet new challenges in the way we do business. We have three esteemed panelists, and I would first like to introduce Mr. Talui Espindola Zanata from Brazil. Talui is an agronomist with the Ministry of Agriculture, Livestock and Food Supply, and he works within a team that designs and updates the Brazilian pesticide residues monitoring program, and he also provides technical input to the Codex Committee on Pesticide Residues. I would also like to introduce Mr. Johnny Marchan Pena from Peru. Johnny is the Executive President of the National Fisheries Health Agency, and he leads the competent authority that regulates health aspects of fisheries and aquaculture. Johnny has held several high-level administrative positions in the Peruvian government. Our third panelist is Mr. Kuan Yu Lin from Chinese Taipei. Kuan Yu is a technical specialist working on imported food regulations in the Food Safety Division of the FDA. And prior to this role, he worked on regulatory aspects of food service and food packaging. So to get the ball rolling, I would like to cue in two short videos. The first from Dr. Visignasi, the Global Head of Regulatory and Scientific Affairs at Nestle, and the second from Dr. Chigima Kadira, the Coordinator for the new Export Trade Program, NEXT, in Kenya. Dr. Kadira is also heavily involved as an SPS and technical expert in food safety horticulture value chains. Thank you. Can we have the videos, please?
Ladies and gentlemen, good morning, good afternoon. I'm Ludovica Verzignassi, Global Head of Regulatory and Scientific Affairs for Nestle. I thank you for this invitation. It is my great pleasure to share with you today Nestle's perspective on risk management and the important role that science has to play in this process. Innovation is Nestle's hallmark. We are committed to developing innovative products and services that provide nutrition and health for people and pets everywhere, across all their life stages, and in a way that's good for our planet. In Nestle R&D, we work to translate science into innovative, concrete food products that will be consumed by millions of consumers. Food safety is paramount to us. Risk management measures too. The safety of food depends on many factors, science being one of them, and on the involvement of the many different actors, governments and the private sector, food manufacturers, ingredient manufacturers, retailers, agriculture sector, etc. To operate in a global world and trade safe food products, it is important that a harmonized set of risk management measures is applied globally, in line with the standards developed by Codex Alimentarius. The private sector can play a significant role in the risk management process led by governments. When identifying a food safety risk managers need to gather evidence on whether or not a proposed solution can be implemented, whether it is feasible or not. In order to support governments in assessing the feasibility of different management options, the private sector can provide a rich source of evidence, own analytical data, practical feasibility of given measures on given product categories, own research investigations published on peer-reviewed journals. For example, at Nestlé, we apply state-of-the-art analytical methods and novel data management approaches to address potential food hazards. As food safety is a rapid evolving field, and indeed this is one of the challenging aspects of risk management, we closely follow and contribute to new scientific developments. Food safety is everybody's responsibility. To enable a science-based decision-making process, the private sector, as a one entity, can definitively contribute to the risk management process through a transparent, consultative approach. If you ask me to share with you today what would be my request related to risk management, well, my wish would be that your governments define, within the Codex Alimentarius general principles, for example, a process supporting the implementation of a transparent consultation with the private sector. This consultation could support a faster development of feasible and applicable risk management options, both for the products we have today on the shelves and also for the innovative food products which are on their way to the market and respond to new consumer trends in line with environmental and sustainability growing needs. Thank you.
My name is Chagama Kadera, working with CP. CP has been involved in risk management over the years. From CP's perspective, risk management entails the following four aspects. One is governance, which looks at the laws, the regulations, and the institutional arrangements that are in place to effect the risk management. The second aspect is on operational processes. How are the laws and regulations implemented? Do they have standard operating procedures? The third aspect is to do with the capacity of those empowered to implement risk management. And the last aspect is the communication and relationship dynamics among the stakeholders. The stakeholders here being both public and private. Close interaction between the public and the private sector are a key towards ensuring effective risk management in any system. Now, in terms of operations, for example, in Kenya, there were challenges that were noted with regards to dealing with issues of maximum residue levels, issues to do with harmful organisms, and this called upon the stakeholders to engage in order to assure that the systems in place would address the issues and there would be no non-compliance issues. This meant that the country had to look for a mechanism, and in this case, it was the National Task Force on Horticulture, which brought together competent authorities, business member organizations, at the CEO level to actually discuss on all issues that were required in terms of managing the noted risks in the value chains. There was continuous engagement among the stakeholders, and in this engagement, the issues to do with transparency, that is open discussion of issues, where there were challenges that needed to be addressed, were all identified. And after identification, recommendations were made and discussed with the ministry in order to get to implementation. The task force was not just about boardroom discussions. As I've indicated, this was at the CEO level, and therefore decisions were made and they were effected immediately. This meant follow-up actions in the field to ensure compliance with the recommendations in terms of implementation, both at the private sector level and what the competent authorities were doing. So that collaboration was effective in ensuring that Kenya continued to assure the market in terms of compliance. And the task force worked so well that in one of the visits, the minister did accompany to look at what the farmers were doing in the field and what the companies were doing at pack house level to assure in terms of compliance. And therefore, it is very important that you get the engagement of the private sector and the public sector in terms of ensuring risk management measures are effectively applied. Of course, we know the challenges that do exist in terms of getting the two to work together. There is the need for capacity building among the private sector. There is need for capacity building among the public sector institutions. There is need to develop standard operating procedures, but these procedures have to be understood on both sides in order to be effective in terms of ensuring risk management issues or risk management plans are implemented.
Thank you very much to both presenters for these thought-provoking videos. The video from Nestle sends a very strong message to governments and the CAC to recognise the important contribution that the food industry can make to risk management decisions on food safety and the need for transparent engagement processes while governments and the CAC make decisions on the appropriate level of protection. Ludovica points out that food companies such as Nestle have a raft of cutting-edge science on control of hazards and are continually exploring the safety of new and innovative foods. This body of knowledge is vital to evaluation of the feasibility and practicality of options for control measures and where they may be best placed in the food chain. She also notes the importance of Codex in harmonizing global standards for food and trade. In extending the theme of public-private partnerships and strongly contributing to effective risk management, Chagima describes an ongoing task force approach to assuring the safety of horticultural products that are subject to use of agricultural chemicals at farm level and perhaps the pack house. Drawing on his experience in Kenya, he is clear that public-private partnerships are not only important for decisions on standards, they must also address implementation issues such as readily understood standard operating practices, the availability of capacity of both government and industry at the field level, and a high level of engagement on the most effective options that is informed from genuine field experience rather than the boardroom. So now we have the first questions for our panelists on how do we harness all the available inputs from stakeholders in arriving at the best risk management decisions, e.g. from internal sources such as risk assessors and also from external sources as in the videos. So the first question to Mr. Kwan Yu, as a risk manager, how do you ensure smooth and unhindered information exchange with agencies tasked with risk assessment and risk communication?
Okay, thanks, Sid. And now we stand between the role between risk assessment and communication. Then I believe we could agree that risk management should be profoundly supported by the information come from risk assessment, and following risk communication could act as translator to make the policy easy to be understood by the public which facilitate the implementation. So firstly, as basic requirement, the allocation of duty, I think it's better to be clear and not to be muddled with each other. I also noticed that participants raised question in previous session about why should there be different. As small comment here, risk assessment is science and evidence-based, while the agency must be neutral and independent to avoid influences on risk assessment by other inputs, such as consideration of cost, resource availability, and etc. However, we still bear in mind that the voice from the industry with practical view is also crucial. Therefore, a platform for more comprehensive information gathering is recommended. Here we got several consultation conference testing with different issues. The consultants may come from various professional areas together or separately. We believe that through the running procedures, the information exchange could be facilitated. Also, to the translator role of the risk communication followed by the risk management, it's recommended to reallocate personnel with not only the professional that risk management or communication need, for example, business management, marketing, or advertisement. We also need those with science profession as intermediary who act as regular contact person or consultant who can keep the information unbiased and free of misunderstanding. And in recent years, we have been used to prepare not only frequently asked questions, but also lazy guides, also the posts on social media. The materials are translated and simplified for public understanding. The feedback from the communication activity could be further inspected to see whether the policy is accepted or transmitted with proper recognition in hope of improving future policy making. That would be some of the general idea for the connection around the risk management. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And certainly that's an interesting comment you make about posting on social media to monitor feedback from the public on the success of some of your decisions. As a follow-up question, could you share your initial reactions to the video clips we have just seen? How do you see the role of the private sector in risk management?
Yeah, from the video, we could learn that the information exchange among the government and the private sector also play an important role. In other words, the partnership could be built in view of better risk management. As a responsible industry, due diligence and corporate social responsibility become indispensable requirements. And as we can learn from the video, innovation is also one of the key factors for the successful industry. About innovation, it is also the factor that may conflict with big risk management, as a novel material or technique may not be under comprehensive research with broad view. Of course, we are welcome that the private sector with capabilities strive to conduct risk analysis and provide the evidences. That's truly help the build out of risk assessment information. However, when it comes to the policy or decision of approval or not by authorities, re-examination with discretion and further information gathering will be followed in order to alleviate the doubt in the risk within. Also, the measures to be implemented are subjected to discussion and review by many other parties, such as consumers, academics, and even other government agencies may be involved. For example, to control the pesticide residue in food, not only the food manufacturers and retailer parts, but also the agriculture and chemical management shall be jointly cooperated to lay out the solution more effectively. And from the previous session, I also found that participants also raised questions that guidelines from Codex OIE are mainly intended for government application. Gratefully, the speaker, Dr. Heide, has already kindly offered the information as references. However, we also recognize similar kind of problem when consulting to our food business operators. Maybe they just need more simplified one or need some help to identify the discrepancy with mandatory regulation. Therefore, our government in recent years also put in effort to incorporate the principle into guidelines, guidance, or tools to private sector to follow up with the policy. On the other hand, I would like to again emphasize that private sector still provide great support as information sources during the risk management. For example, consumer may urge to pursue extremely strict rules to control risk, which we may already know that from SPS agreement that it would be impractical and even creating unnecessary trade barrier to others if the science base is not strong enough. At that point, how comprehensive information we could retrieve and interpret to the public significantly influence the result. A sound policy may stem from good balance among feasibility, governance capacity, and public trust. Therefore, to maintain the partnership in information exchange among government agency and private sector is one of the strategies we could consider to improve risk management. That is what we can learn from the video and a little point from me. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that very comprehensive response. Could I now turn to Johnny? Johnny, could you share with us experience related to risk management at the domestic level in Peru? Are you harmonizing risk management decisions at the domestic level with those made at the international level?
Okay, empiezo. La gestión de riesgo para
risk management in Peru has two implementation dimensions. One, preparing institutions to manage their risk management focus. The second dimension is centered, in essence, around the change in model, the key models in the institution, and you need to bear in mind that Peru, in earlier times, we have been looking at outbreaks, and we have been responding to this by looking at our processes, and this has been a preventative tool approach. But what needs to be bear in mind is that it's operators and the heads of departments who are responsible for in the companies producing bear the responsibility for checking they are in line with standards. Now, in the first dimension, the preparation of institutions, allowing them to take up a risk-based management approach, we have been working to define 5 strategic lines. First, modifying the architecture of the institutions, looking at the broad picture of institutions and looking at the greatest relevancy, or rather to bring greater relevancy to the safety of foods, and in our case, fisheries and agriculture. And the other important element is that we have been giving greater focus on technology and the solutions that it can bring. So with these strategic guidelines, we are reviewing all of our processes throughout the trade process, including the introduction of technological solutions, as I've been saying, into a number of different processes. We have been strengthening the capacity of our technical staff and our specialists, and we are giving greater priority to research activities. On the management of a company or an institution, what we do is manage through our processes. In other words, we're looking at the continuity, the best way we can continue the methods by adapting them, and looking again at the priorities of the clients from our point of view, which are our producers, our clients. So we've been looking to summarize and schematize this process into 4 steps. First, identifying risks. To bear this out, Peru, for a little more than 2 years, has been going through all of its regulatory processes for the previous 3 years, looking at different agricultural and fisheries safety reports. We've conducted studies, for example, for pollutants, and at the same time, again, promoting studies in this area. This has allowed us to have a solid context in which we can identify the risks. That's step 1. The second step is the analysis of the data from the first step. And we have been looking at how to reduce risk for those involved and how they can change their model. And so this is a review process of our protocols and making modifications to key processes under the control of the regulator. So strengthening our role, improving our position, working alongside, but also certifying the products coming from the sector. The third step, and we are aware that there are certain strategies for implementing risk management, and the first being the organization of our legal framework, our safety standards, that is. So we had thought we need to start somewhere in the basic risk analysis, and we started in the processing plants, both in fisheries and agriculture, and then we rolled this out across the rest of the food processing chain. Then, and looking at how this is being implemented, we're currently updating 4 different regulations on food safety and on the administrative processes, as well as a regulation that sets out the safety criteria of foods that are marketed and which have an international element, and that makes up some 40% of our regulatory arsenal in this case. So in terms of implementing this model, we've been categorizing this under risk assessment, and I think we've been through around 100 processing plants, and we hope to reach 150 by the end of the year. We have classified different aquaculture plants as well this year. We've strengthened our traceability system and implemented a number of IT solutions that are used to conduct health monitoring, as well as feeding into the research that we have. Some of the concrete steps and changes that we have done in implementing a risk management approach: we've modified our income model, the certification model, and it's been some time now since we changed the process there. And now certification is almost completely automatic. We've changed some checks and verification processes, particularly for pollutants and other contaminants, to make those more agile. And another example, we are currently going through a full review of the laboratory references, or reference laboratories rather, and conducting tests there. And this has been very useful because one of the network of these labs that we have in agriculture and fisheries is becoming increasingly solid and producing the analysis that we need, for example, to put products on a market. It's also meant that we, as an institution, produce a broader series of data. We have a broader scope of analysis, and we can employ mathematical models. For example, we're trying to also review all of the different solutions and models that may be available to us. But of course, that's going to require a lot more research, much of which is pending. So those are some of the processes that in Peru we have been reviewing to introduce a risk-based approach to our food health and safety. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Johnny. I mean, obviously, you're undergoing a very comprehensive and proactive review of many elements of your national food control system, modelled on the fisheries example. Can I quickly ask, have you a high level of support and resourcing from your government to achieve this?
Yes, and we should acknowledge that agriculture and fisheries are very important in our country. We produce more than 100 species traded internationally,
and we have a group of trading partners, clients, that stretches across more than 50 countries, including within the EU, China, Russia, Australia, and as you know, these are countries which are very demanding when it comes to food safety. So we pay particularly close attention to respecting the international regulatory framework in that sense.
Thank you very much. Could I move on to our third panelist, Talui? And a question for you, Talui. Could you also share with us experiences related to risk management at the domestic level in Brazil?
Of course, Steve, thank you. Well, first of all, I'd like to clarify that my role in the Ministry of Agriculture, Livestock and Food Supply of Brazil, MAPA, is prominently technical and related to pesticide residues in plant-derived products. So today I'm going to have an approach specifically about this matter. Well, in Brazil, we have two national pesticide monitoring programs applied to products of plant origin. Both are ruled by national laws in their respective decrees. One of them is led by Brazilian Health Regulatory Agency, Anvisa, that's linked to Ministry of Health, which is additionally responsible for pesticide risk assessment, setting maximum residue levels, MRLs, to pesticides, always adopting a science-based approach according to Codex Alimentarius Procedural Manual, consisting in hazard identification, hazard characterization, exposure assessment, and risk characterization. Besides this, the program database is used to evaluate possible health issues to the population, considering short and long-term intake. Yeah, the second program is managed by Ministry of Agriculture, MAPA, and its general rules are under regulation published by MAPA. This program is divided in three main inspection sub-programs concerning national products and imported products and its exported products. I think it's significant to highlight that MAPA's program not just produce data to future risk assessment by Anvisa, but it also has supported Brazilian authorities and managers. Once national products fated to exportations are evaluated, taking into account Codex MRLs. And depending on the case, MRLs of importer countries are considered too. I'd like to point to that there's a working group responsible for design and updating this program. International standards and guidelines, especially from Codex Alimentarius, are considered when the scope of active substance to be analyzed and the list of products and commodities are chosen. And those rules are fundamental also on selection of a proper statistical basis to determine the sample sizes and procedures, and indeed helping to elect the analytical method driven by MAPA's laboratory net. And in conclusion, considering the context explained, we can broadly say that Anvisa, our regulatory agency linked to Ministry of Health, is like the joint FAO, the WHO, JMPR, Joint Meeting on Pesticide Residues, because they're responsible for risk assessment. And MAPA, it's similar, like CCPR, Codex Committee on Pesticide Residues, responsible for risk management. Thank you. Over.
Thank you. Thank you very much. We've heard a lot about risk assessment and risk-based programs. Could I ask, in terms of the design of your monitoring program for pesticide and agriculture chemicals, do you implement a risk-based sampling program according to the guidelines that are currently being developed by the Codex Committee on Methods of Analysis and Sampling?
Yes, absolutely. When we schedule our meetings to define the next year program, we take into account the Codex guidelines and manuals, and actually it's on our legislation in our regulation that defines the scope of the program. Thank you.
Right, thank you very much. So we've had some rich experiences of risk management from a member's perspective, but what about some of the challenges? And as we move into this part of the roundtable, we're going to start with a poll question to the audience. And this poll question concerns, what are the main challenges with risk management? The choices we have are incorporating uncertainty of risk assessments, considering inputs other than SPS risk assessment, engagement with private sector or consumers, consistency in levels of protection amongst sectors, and finally, harmonization with international standards. And could you please take 1 minute or so to answer the poll? Possible to have those questions up on the screen? If not, we've had about a minute for responses. So could we please see what we've got from those questions? Okay, well, while we're waiting for the poll questions, perhaps we could move on in terms of the challenges facing risk managers at the domestic level. And back to Talui again for the first question. What are the main challenges at the domestic level to making evidence-based and consistent risk management decisions for SPS purposes? Have you faced similar challenges to those from the poll, which unfortunately we haven't seen yet? And can you draw from some of the risk management experiences you brought to us in your earlier response?
Yeah, I believe it build on inspection programs is always challenging. And it's crucial to progressively improve the analytical scope of hazards and products to be evaluated. Thus, it will be possible to reinforce the official database, providing rapid answers about how safe the product is. So the main challenge is to identify how hazards are being set internationally, then introduce this information on national risk management and evaluate the product's non-compliance likelihood, and check out if it could mean or not a trade or a health issue. All right.
Okay, thank you. Could we move on to Kuan Yu and a question in the same area? What are the main challenges you have faced in risk management activities at the domestic level? And how do they compare with some of the challenges that Talui raised in regard to management of pesticides?
Okay, from the pro, we can see that because the food is also a good example for the food, because the risk liked in the food is complicated. And from my personal experience, I would consider that sorting out solutions to satisfy multiple inputs is one of the main challenges for government agencies which is often linked to the transparency of procedure of policymaking, and also at the beginning, from the risk assessment, the information needs to be integrated. Usually, the international standards are adopted as basic rule, which could be supported by relatively more comprehensive evidences and act as good reference to persuade people that the food under this standard are safe. And that is also a direct way to cope with transparency issue. However, since the information become easily available and civic participation become a trend in governance, people tend to express their thoughts in many ways. For example, people may argue that some of the risks are specific to areas or cultures or anything else, and the government should take strong action to ensure the public health. Sometimes it may be reasonable because one of the assessment input is the food intake under specific conditions. And similarly, the legislature or consumer groups may make effort to lobby toward a stricter standard compared to that of international standard. Of course, as government, we know that the practical view from the private sector still cannot be omitted. Thus, the balanced policy taken by the government is inevitably undergoing negotiation, assistance in industrial upgrading, or alternative measures might be taken. On the contrary, the private sector may also reflect comments that the policy may be too strict or even being challenged with lacking of clear evidence. Thus, we put in lots of efforts taking measures and preparation, almost like risk communication, before one policy could be drafted out. Since the food supply system and risk spreading are quite complicated, it still needs our effort to gather supported information as much as we can to make the risk management promptly fulfilled. Thank you.
You mentioned the issue of harmonizing international standards with domestic standards, and sometimes that's a problem. In one of the earlier sessions on risk assessment, we heard a lot about the new science of estimating food safety risks associated with mixtures of chemicals in foods, and the fact we're searching for new knowledge on health impact of these mixtures. Have you come across that as a problem when looking at domestic standards and trying to harmonize them with international standards?
Yes, and there are some cases that we face with such a question because the mixture and the complexity of the food or the food additive often occur in our lives. And we also still try to make the compromise between the food safety and how the industry could implement it. And that is my comment here.
Thank you. So we're having a little bit of trouble getting our poll questions and answers up, but we will move on from that section on challenges to successes. And here we have another poll question, and I'll try again and read it out. The poll question is, what are success factors for risk management? Again, we have several choices. The first one, a well-resourced and sound domestic regulatory system. The second, robust and independent risk assessment. The third, differentiation between science-based inputs and other inputs. 4, transparency of process. 5, cooperation among government agencies. 6, good risk communication with non-government actors. And 7, monitoring and reviewing the measures. So quite a comprehensive list of what we anticipate are some important success factors for risk management. And could you please respond to the poll over the next minute or so?
Sí, yo podría añadir.
I could add something regarding the factors, the success factors. They have to update the standards framework, not only look at international legal framework, but also we have to look at the recommendations of the Codex Alimentarius, and we also look at the food standards for neighboring countries. Now, there are different factors that are very interesting when it comes to surveillance. It doesn't only start with the standards, but you have to see what the operator is actually doing, the food industry is doing. So it's very important. For example, a laboratory has to have the proper wherewithal and to be able to work on scientific evidence. They have to have the technology and has to be used intensively. This is what will make it possible to arrive at success as well when it comes to managing risks. So it means a lot of analysis and arriving at better conclusions, improving the capacities of the specialists, the technical staff as well. All of this is a very interesting factor. This makes it possible to arrive at success when it comes to risk management. Now, the idea, there's also the idea when we can have a number of incentives, economic incentives for the various operators so that they carry out the risk analysis properly. And we also have to focus on continual improvement. So carry out risk analysis, but we know that this is something that's ongoing. It never really reaches an end. So we have to constantly seek to improve the mechanisms and the various tasks carried out by the laboratories. Thank you.
Thank you, Johnny. And it's clear that in terms of success, there are many elements of risk management that have to work together and have to work well if we are going to achieve a robust and sound national regulatory system. Just in terms of returning to those success factors and questions, can I ask, Johnny, how important is transparency of process in terms of the success of a risk-based food control program?
Okay.
That's very important, of course. The experience has shown that when we try to design a protocol to implement risk analysis, and so a protocol that's set out by the health operators, the responsible people, but also the operators as well, the industry. So we've used international standards, of course, that we find in manuals, in codes and books. We want to be sure that we are able to have an efficient model, and what we do is to carry out a pilot project. And that was in 2019. And in this pilot project, what we did was to involve a number of people in risk analysis. We brought in 11 different processing plants for 19 different products, mainly fish products. And so they were able to work on the various standards, technological. We saw that there's some shortfalls in compatibility, some gaps that had to be closed. We had to work with specialized technical staff. And so there were also some issues of an economic nature as well. And so we had to see to it that there were economic results that were interesting for the industries. And what we did was to disseminate this protocol when it was ready. We did this through workshops and training courses as well. And then after that, we kicked off a process whereby we could implement the model in Peru with this management model that's based on risk analysis is voluntary in nature. It's voluntary. And so the operator tells us that they want to be part of it, and so they're some programs that are of different lengths. We can carry out, on audit, in general audit, we try to analyze the risks that exist. The risks in the infrastructure, and then also risks that are infrastructure related, and then risk when it comes to the food product that is being processed. What is the resource being processed? And so we also carry out, for example, if it's a product or forestry or fish or aquaculture, and these give rise to a classification of the processing plant. And so what we do is to determine certain things. There's continual reference, continual information that's provided, but also look at the question of taxation as well, and the control parameters, and how often these parameters have to be measured. What is the frequency? And so here, in such a case, the operator, the processing plant, knows the model very well. They can take part in a very effective way. And so there is a level of confidence, of trust that must be maintained in the operator on the part of the authority. So it's quite transparent, in fact.
Okay. Thank you very much, Johnny, for another very comprehensive response. And I think it's interesting that you introduced economic factors there as quite important in terms of establishing food control programs at the domestic level and settings for risk management. I think another thing that you mentioned that's very interesting is this idea of food culture, whereby there is a partnership between the government and the business owner, and that they take primary responsibility for compliance and ensuring that they're meeting regulatory requirements, and thereby building a greater confidence between themselves and the regulator. Could I now move on to Talui again and ask you a question in terms of success factors, Talui? What have you found to be key approaches and decision frameworks that can be employed in risk management, including regarding the evaluation of risk management options, implementation of measures, as well as monitoring and review?
Hey, Steve. Yeah, I think once information is collected under scientific approach methodology, harmonized to risk assessment, managers will be able to properly evaluate if this database is compliant to national or international standards. Thus, it's possible to act promptly to reduce risks like this, and as well as avoiding trade issues. I think this information is significant when updating risk management policy is necessary. And we have also to mention, we use some variables like the consumer's habit, consumer's culture, non-compliance levels of products, value of commodities. It's all of those variables are taken into account when we design our management program. That's it.
Okay. Thank you. I just want to explore another success factors and a question to Kuan Yu in terms of cooperation among government agencies. Different government systems have different arrangements in terms of scientific evidence and risk communication resources being inside the agency or provided as an external and independent resource, such as EFSA in the European situation. Could you comment on ensuring, as well as having a high level of cooperation among government agencies in terms of inputs to risk management, how you ensure that there is no bias and independence is maintained?
Yes, as mentioned here, there are many agencies of a government that take part in the risk management. For example, I'm here in the food safety sector, but also there are agriculture, economic, and also for the environmental protection, so on. So there have to, each agency have their opinions on each on the topic. So we also have to have many conference to call the conference to make everybody to sit down to talk about how the solution we can make we can have the same conclusion for the solution for the problem here. That.
Okay. Okay. Thank you. Obvious value in sitting down with counterparts and sharing data and resources to arrive at effective risk management decisions. We have another poll question. I think we'll pass over it and talk very briefly about some of these inputs to risk management other than risks to human health or plant health or animal health, and whether or not the panelists have a formal way and a transparent way of ranking inputs to risk management decisions other than health risk assessment. We heard from Gretchen Stanton very early on in this workshop that risk analysis as an SPS discipline is not yet mature. And one of the great challenges in risk management is how to balance the goal of maximizing health protection while at the same time taking due account of other inputs to decision making, such as feasibility and costs and economic impacts of control measures. And I would like to start by asking Johnny whether or not in the situation he has described with fisheries in Peru, whether there is a formal and transparent system for ranking some of these other risk management criteria other than health.
In Peru, as we say, we focus on a very transparent methodology. It's written down. It's part of the international legislation as well. We look at that, but we also bear in mind the legislation of the countries of destination where our products will be shipped to, where they're going. And when it comes to transparency, we have a traceability system, and it's manually operated. This makes it possible to improve the system. And so we have traceability, starting from the informatics system, the IT system, and we share this information. We share this information with our trading partners as well. And so, for example, we work together with the EU and also with the authorities in China, where we share our information emanating from our platform. But have a system that's very robust. We want to be able to totally integrate this platform so that very quickly we can make available notifications. And for the time being, it takes time. There's a bit of a lag time making available alerts or notifications. We want to be far more nimble, more agile. And for Peru, of course, all health information is very, very important. We look at different zones, and we want to make sure that the information is made available very quickly. This can make it possible, once again, to strengthen trust in the eyes of our trading partners. Thank you.
Thank you, Johnny. So I think in this session on success factors, it's very clear that there is a great range of success factors that are important, if we are going to make effective risk management decisions. We've heard of success factors from traceability and ensuring trust and confidence in our export markets, right through to continual improvement in risk analysis and risk profiling, working closely with industry in terms of ensuring a good food culture at premises level and making sure that primary responsibility is taken by industry for managing risks. And lastly, Johnny has mentioned the need to be agile in terms of introducing new information and getting ahead of the game and being proactive in terms of risk management decisions rather than reactive and responding to adverse events, which of course are damaging to international trade. I think moving on now from this section to international standards, and we'll try one more poll question. And the poll question is, have international standards contributed to improving risk management at the domestic level? And this is a very simple poll question compared to the previous ones. The first option is yes, international standards have contributed to improving domestic protection. Second answer is no. And the third one is sitting on the fence in saying only to a certain extent. So could we please take a few seconds and respond to that poll question? And of course, this harks back to the quite extensive discussion that we had earlier in the session under risk management and the influence of risk management decision-making in relation to the SPS agreement and principles. So I'm not sure if we're going to get that poll question up.
Hi, Steve. It's Greg McDonald here.
Hi,
we
Greg.
do see the questions in the poll and now the results. So perhaps I can just read you the quick results we got in. And
Sure.
the yes in the question of have international standards contributed to improving risk management at the domestic level is 71% of respondents say yes. 5% say no. And the sitting on the fence, only to a certain extent, is 25%. So almost 3/4 yes, and then varying levels.
Right. Okay. Thanks very much for that intervention, Greg. And certainly very heartening to have 71% of the audience agreeing that the work done by the international standard setting organizations has significantly contributed to improving risk management at the domestic level. And we have heard throughout this session and other sessions how risk assessments in particular generated by the international bodies, scientific bodies, provide a database whereby at the domestic level, countries can use those benchmarks and harmonize their own standards with those set by the international bodies. So very heartening and certainly a vote of thanks to our international agencies. And given that strong influence of the international bodies on domestic standard setting and risk management, could I ask a question of Kuan Yu? In your experience, how have international standards contributed to improving risk management at the domestic level and facilitating trade?
Yes, and I found the poll result is quite a little bit surprising because I guess that they think that there is a positive response to expect from adopting international standard to risk management at domestic level. But I guess it may be reasonable because for some of the standard may not be applicable to some of the area or aspects. So maybe some have another consideration. And for my experience in food import management is one of classic example. it could be even fundamental to adopt such idea. When taxing with the risk of imported food, management targets have extended from domestic area to overseas, which lead to possible condition that regulation in one country may or may not be identical to others. Therefore, at this point, I would say the existence of international standards really saves our lives to some extent. In realistic view, management resources are limited. Therefore, adopting well-accepted guidelines or standards could be the smart way, not to mention the convenience to communicate among export and import authority by such common language. Here, I also emphasize that the international standard could also back up for our decision of risk management with strong support even in the domestic view. For example, to clarify the concept of risk control out of the demand of zero risk without ample evidences, it could be very difficult to persuade people that the decision have already considered affordable risk for public health. The international standard acts as incorporate knowledge shared by global nations could thus be adopted to deal with the questioning quite enough. Therefore, trustworthiness and transparency of those decisions made by government could be ensured hopefully. In other way, we also implement the HACCP or other global principles to mandate our food business operator to implement, and such principle could also help our industry to export their product to other countries because there is a shared common sense of the great better food management in their food safety issues. And that is, thank you.
Right. Thank you very much. I think that figure of 71% is certainly not surprising to me because we're not only dealing with standards, for example, for maximum residue limits in food for chemical residues, but the outputs of the international agencies are often in the form of guidelines and advice. And when we look at some of the general purpose committees, even though they are not developing hard-edge standards for hazards in foods, they are providing a lot of very good information whereby governments at the domestic level can incorporate those principles and guidelines in the way they carry out best practice for controlling sanitary and phytosanitary hazards. So I think 71% is, is quite a good barometer of how useful international standards and guidelines are. I think, could I ask a question of Talui and following up on this issue? Do you see any gaps, Talui, in existing international standards dealing with SPS risk management in regarding to your domestic trade interests in Brazil?
Yes. I think it's always challenging to establish MRLs or MLs to combinations commodity hazard in a broad way. So I'm talking about pesticides, residues, chemical contaminants, heavy metals, and others. That's the reason I believe it's important to incentive members to share and be open to comments about their risk assessment evaluations. Strengthening and boosting up international database concerning possible gaps and missing standards. So, of course, we know the MRLs set by Codex help us a lot with because it's set broadly to group our class of commodities. But I think it's almost impossible to that there will be no gaps. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Could I ask you, in terms of moving away from pesticide residues for a minute and talking about environmental contaminants, where we have to set standards that are based on as low as achievable in terms of food and trade, have you situations in Brazil where you have marked differences between allowable levels of environmental contaminants compared to those in international standards?
I'm sorry, Steve. It was breaking off a little bit.
Okay. I'll say it again. Just in terms of moving away from pesticide residues for a minute and thinking about environmental contaminants where we can't control necessarily the levels in the food supply down to a very low level, do you have any differences in Brazil where international standards have ended up being different from those in your domestic legislation for environmental contaminants?
Okay. Yeah, I think it would be appropriate if a analyst from our health agents regulatory answer this one, because for me it's too specific. It's more related to managing pesticide residues. So I'm sorry, I can't answer that.
That's fine. Maybe I could ask one of the other panelists whether they would like to respond to the issue of environmental contaminants and levels of protection that are as low as reasonably achievable. Kuan Yu, perhaps.
We also still, when we face such problem, we also have to gathering many information to consult on the academic for our decision whether to take into their consideration. Yeah.
Okay. So, Kuan Yu, do you see any particular gaps in existing international standards that you would like to see filled or improved on in regard to your national situation, your domestic situation?
As I shared previously, we face the we get the international standard with help with our trade. So when we talk about the gap, maybe they come from the discrepancy between the international standard with our domestic standards. So then we will have to, for example, to defend ourselves why we determine our domestic standard and how the evidence that we may make that decision. Maybe that is one of the examples here. Then.
Okay, thank you. Maybe I could be a bit provocative and ask the panelists whether anyone would like to comment on some of these new concepts of food security and food sustainability, and whether or not the international standard setting agencies should be starting to debate some of these issues as they develop food standards. Any takers on that subject? Okay, maybe not. A little too controversial at this stage. Okay, so thanks very much for that session. And now I think we'll move on to the last bit of our roundtable before the Q&A and talk about global changes in approaches to risk management. And I think as the last part of our roundtable, it'd be really useful to briefly explore some of the contemporary changes in the international trading environment and how they are impacting on risk management decisions and their implementation. It's quite clear that it's not only the standards themselves that are important in risk management and determining the level of protection, but the context in which they are implemented and monitored and reviewed is equally important in making sure that we have an environment of continuous improvement. Some of the examples where we are seeing global drivers for change are climate and the impact on changing biosecurity and food safety risks. We have talked about the current COVID pandemic in previous sessions and the fact that this has restricted the ability to do foreign audits for a lot of countries, and we're relying more and more on equivalence agreements and trust and confidence in the suppliers of the food we import than previously when we had relatively free access for auditing and verification. Similarly, we've seen in recent times quite significant changes in global food supply chains with changing consumer demographics and preferences. And this is not only a food safety issue, but also a biosecurity issue, in that this changing food supply can obviously be a pathway for animal and plant health hazards. So in terms of this global changes and approaches, could I ask, starting with Kuan Yu, some WTO members adopt the general philosophy that SPS risk associated with imported goods should be increasingly managed by the exporting member rather than managed at the border by the importing member or post-border, thereby placing more emphasis on assurances provided by the exporting member. This could be summarized in some ways as shifting risk offshore. Do you agree that this is a change in general philosophy in terms of international trade in food and biosecurity goods?
Yes, and as I work in about the food import management, under the concept of source management, I guess such tendency is quite understandable. It is also an important policy under consideration and already implemented on specific food here. So I guess that I can partially agree that the philosophy can be adopted. And we can explain that the SPS risks may occur in various nodes along with the food supply chain, maybe beginning from the producer or collector, the exporter, and the import inspection, and finally to the distribution chain to the consumer. More specifically, during the post-port or post-imported stages, managers or inspectors have limited information only through the examination of standards and labeling. As everyone knows, food manufacturing technology is developing rapidly. Purification, or at least removal of impurities or unwanted contaminants, have become common sense to maintain a robust quality control. Therefore, if the industry produced with meticulous processing procedures, the food products will be...
Sorry, we're losing a bit of sound here.
Oh, sorry?
I'm sorry, we're losing a bit of sound. Could you repeat that, please?
Okay, sure. Maybe, should I begin from the...
Yes, please.
From the first? Okay, sorry. And from this concept, I would have to say that because of the source management, such tendency is quite understandable. It's also an important policy under consideration and already implemented on specific here. And I would say that the SPS risks may occur in various nodes along with the food supply chain, beginning from the producer or collectors, the export and import inspection, and finally to the distribution chain to consumers. More specifically, during the post-imported or the post-port stage, managers or inspector or even the...
I'm sorry, I'm losing your sound again.
Hi, Steve. It's Greg McDonald again. We can hear pretty clear on our side, so I'm not sure if it's a connection issue in the middle of the night now in New Zealand or if it's more broad.
Okay. Oh, well, let's plug on.
Okay, then I'm going on. So therefore, if the food procedure processing can be done carefully, the food product could be expected to conform with the requirement concerning the sanitation standards. However, the original materials may already come from that are not suitable for human consumption. So here we may be confident with the SPS risk already incorporated in sanitation standard, where we can do by examination of the standards, but other unexpected contamination are unknown, which is often not acceptable by consumers and could only be under control by audit on processing stage or not in food supply chain from the beginning. Consequently, I could say that the emphasis on assurance provided by the exporting country is one of the approach to address this consideration. And here we also have some regulation to require our importer to send out the assurance, for example, the sanitation, to show that the food is suitable for human consumption, to take the file along with importation application. So here is some of the experience here now. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much. Could you just enlarge a little on your statement about the increasing emphasis on assurances provided by the exporting country, particularly in relation to what might be new hazards or hazards associated with innovative foods that you don't have any experience of as yet? Are you saying that you are putting more trust in the assurances provided by countries in terms of an equivalence arrangement or a recognition arrangement?
Yes, if we talk into the deeper parts, we can say that for different foods and for different risks, there may be different conditions. For example, for the risk we already know we already know that, for example, the norovirus in the previous session, we may want to make sure that because it may be eaten raw, so you have to be free of the norovirus in the bivalve. So we also have some regulation to make sure that they have the original assurance about this risk. But for example, for the COVID-19, there are also some issue to talk that we maybe some of the virus may be found on the food or other commodities, and we maybe try to get some information from the exporting country, but also we still have our examination on our imported commodity to make sure that we also have our information on this risk. Oh, that's, thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Just to push on with these drivers of change in trade and food and biosecurity goods in the modern era, could I direct a question to you, Johnny? And that is, as a consequence of the COVID-19 pandemic, are exporting WTO members embracing alternative verification and assurance approaches, such as remote auditing by the importing member? And this follows on nicely from the answer we've just had from Kuan Yu on increasing reliance on assurances provided by exporting countries.
Yes. In Peru, when the pandemic arrived, we launched a number of digitalized processes. So we're starting with certification, which was at that time pretty much paper-based. We moved that to a digital system. And now this introduces two levels of safety. We have a Pan-American one and a regional one. Cloud-based certificates, which, of course, our client countries buying Peruvian products can therefore easily access. I'm referring to the documents themselves. And this was the idea of generating assurances precisely. And we do this also through the different verifications that we do, including on-site verifications. And currently, we are indeed undertaking remote auditing in China at the moment, and this is generating a lot of interest, this country particularly, and whether it meets the biosecurity protocols required by the country throughout the processing chain, including the production plants. And we have therefore joined this willingly. It wasn't something we expected, but we are conducting remote auditing, and it's allowing us to confirm, of course, there are limits, but it does allow us to confirm that the standards, SPS standards, are being met with regard to a specific product, as well as biosecurity issues in the context of stopping the spread of COVID. Now, in terms of remote auditing as a normal practice and the idea of making this a digital process for operators, working alongside laboratories. So if we think about those who are importing trout and sheep into Peru, or seafoods, or likewise coming from other countries, yes, perhaps.
That's it.
Okay. Thank you. You raised the question of normalization of new ways of auditing, such as remote auditing in a post-COVID environment. Do you think that some of these digital methods will actually become normalized?
Estoy convencido.
I believe so, yes. We, in terms of our experience in Peru, is that we have substantively improved the processes through digitalization and automation, including remote auditing. Now, of course, it's not a full replacement for an on-site audit, but essentially it is an improvement. And again, we're importing some 60 or so species. It's a complex task for us. Furthermore, we have a large territory, which also complicates national auditing. So yes, progressively improving.
Right. Thank you very much for that, Johnny. So one last question in this section, and it's to Talui. In the absence of international guidance, are such approaches that we've just talked about, risk management responses to changes in global food supply chains and biosecurity goods changes, are such approaches being negotiated more on a bilateral basis or a multilateral basis? In other words, are we arriving at an environment where we're tending to set up trade arrangements between trading partners on more on a bilateral than a multilateral basis, as we have envisaged in the past? Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Steve. Yeah, Brazil is always open to discuss the appropriate level of protection. And in considering risk management options, Brazil includes regional approaches. Brazil also takes into consideration what other national authorities are doing. We make a big effort to participate in multilateral forums, but in their absence, we are open to negotiate bilaterally, always with sound scientific justification. And I can quote Mercosur, our Southern Common Market as an example. Once again, on pesticide residues matter. There's a resolution published by Mercosur ruling which MRL is applied to fresh products of plant origin traded between country members. So mostly it will be Codex MRL. But if this is a missing information, depending on case, it will be used the MRL set by the importer or by the exporter country. Of course, always regarding possible health issues that could be assessed by interested parties. That's it. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Talui. And I think Mercosur certainly is a good example of adapting to regional drivers where there is an appropriate need and also serviced by good risk assessment, etc. So that brings us to the end of our roundtable workshop session. And now we're going to move into the Q&A with participants for the last 15 minutes. And there are a number of Q&A questions in the box. I'm just having a look at those at the moment. But before we start, could I first address a question to all of our panelists and whether or not any of them would like to make any additional remarks that you did not get a chance to make in our earlier discussions or that you've thought about since, especially in relation to interventions from other speakers in the round table. Is there any burning issues that our panelists want to raise at this stage? Okay, so if everyone's satisfied with the discussion where we've got to so far, I'm going to read a question from Romano Zilli, who has posted, don't we think that we may often mismatch the risk analysis or risk assessment, I'm assuming RA, aimed at establishing limits and thresholds in food standards, and the risk assessment performed in order to modulate official and private checks to keep production in compliance, cause issues for risk managers? Could I ask Mr. Guan Yu if you could respond to that?
Yes, I see the question that maybe also there should maybe conflict between the assessment and the management, which will affect on the government and the industry. So here I would say that the standard or the former, the information get from the risk assessment is flexible and maybe change with time. We can re-examine the information we got from the assessment and from the practical view, or when we go into the in the private sector, when they find that there are problems to implement them, then maybe a new risk assessment shall be re-examined.
Okay, thank you for that. I would like to ask another question to Johnny. You talked earlier about responses to new drivers in terms of international trade and digitalization, and there seems to be two opportunities. One is to move to digital systems, but still supported by paper certification. And the second is moving completely to paperless systems. Do you see that as the future in Peru for providing assurances?
Sí, yo creo.
Yes, I think this is the future. and I think things will be better. What we are doing in our Food Safety Authority, again, with all these processes to optimize the different procedures and to integrate technical solutions for the pretty much across the board to issue digital certificates. So it turned out to be much easier. IT solutions have made it much easier for us to provide these sufficient assurances. It's a system that works, and I've mentioned the 4 different aspects that we have brought in, but again, this is a progressive process and we hope to achieve more. And what I was saying earlier again is about the integration of platforms where there is an increase in churn speed, there's no problem in sharing documents, and opening those up to buyers of Peruvian products. And likewise, when it comes to early warnings systems and notifications, automation is also important. So we think that all of this is helping build confidence, and that digitalization and verification all helps very much.
Okay. Thanks for that, Johnny. One more question, perhaps looking again a little bit into the future. A question to Kuan Yu. When deviating from international standards at the domestic level, what steps have you taken to establish and communicate an SPS measure based on different risk management inputs to stakeholder groups that have a high domestic interest?
Yes, it may be a complicated issue because we also tend to not to deviate from the international standard in order to be harmonized. But when it comes to in case, maybe it still happens in reality. We still have to reconsider and gather new information. For example, I would say that for the most fundamental principle is we have to re-examine what information we could get from the risk, the uncertainty, severity, and probability of the risk is often some of the factors we consider in a risk assessment. And following would be the input from the public or the industry issue. For example, the perception of the risk, the schedule risk, how we implement the policy, and the cost of the measure for the private sector, and that also we have to take into consideration. So under this preparation, I could say that we should we can gather this information and create or draft some scenarios or possible options, which may include the analysis of how the benefits, the drawbacks, and the possible costs lie within it. And secondly, I would like to say that the stakeholders still need to be identified again and communicate with them in order to make sure that everyone to get the policy smoothly. So the information gathering should greatly support the processes during that process. And so some compromise, such as we have the counseling effort or some incentives for the industry during the communication, could be returned to the, we can add into the scenario we created before, and we can get what the decision among this scenario after we gather information more completely. That we could be very confident with the final policy we determine. That is, thank you.
Thank you very much. It was a difficult question, and I was losing some sound towards the end, but that was a great response. I've just got one more question, and it's abbreviated from a question from Yonghuk Lee from the Republic of Korea, who raises the issue of equivalence, and it is something we haven't really talked about much in this session on risk management. And equivalence, of course, is a fantastic SPS provision whereby a government can invest in a transparent and sound risk assessment process and outcome-based standards to realize the natural advantages of food production or biosecurity trade pathways based on the SPS principle, which allows this natural advantage to be expressed. Do any of the panelists have experience whereby they have negotiated an equivalence agreement that has markedly improved the economics of a particular trade pathway by taking a natural advantage? Perhaps, Johnny, in terms of fish exports, you've negotiated some equivalence arrangements whereby you've taken advantage of your natural production systems to gain market access through equivalence arrangements?
Sí, nosotros.
Yes, we have a practice of issuing equivalencies, for example, with the European Union for trading a number of products. We implement standards, starting with the classification of production areas. This is very important for being able to guarantee in advance that these products do indeed come from the area stated and that it is in line with international standards. We do the same with China, fish products and others, and we have a practice of reaching agreements that are not only harmonized certificates but even go so far as establishing protocols for the trade of these products, which are done again from the product, the producer, all the way to the verification stage. Thank you.
Thank you, Johnny, and that's a very positive way, I think, to end our round table in terms of the opportunities a risk-based approach and good risk management decision-making can lead to trade advantage through equivalence arrangements. I'd like to very much thank the panelists who have been very active and positive throughout the round table. Thank you, Talui, Kwan Yu, and Johnny. Thanks again to the organisers, and I'd like to hand back to Greg to end the session.
Thank you very much, Professor Hathaway, for facilitating this roundtable and for all the speakers for their rich discussion we had this afternoon in Geneva time on sharing their experiences on risk management. So this brings us to the end of the workshop for today. We'll reconvene tomorrow morning at 10 a.m. Geneva time to discuss issues pertaining to risk communication and for case study presentations on all aspects of risk analysis. Before we conclude, I just want to thank again all the speakers today for their thought-provoking discussions, all the participants and attendees who have asked questions and who are with us today. Some of the interventions today already foreshadowed the relevance of risk communication that we'll get into tomorrow in the context of SPS risk analysis activities, and I look forward to the discussion. I wish everybody a good evening, a good middle of the night to you, Steve, and a good day to everybody else on the call. Thank you.